Emily was almost fired from her job, but things changed in an unexpected way. On an ordinary morning, a small act of kindness completely changed a life. Yesterday, she was a waitress quietly helping a hungry man. Today, a military convoy stopped at her door, and her name was announced in front of everyone. Who was that man? What did they want? And how did Emily's ordinary life suddenly get turned upside down? Don't miss this story, which shows that a true act of kindness can open doors in the most unexpected ways. Early in the morning, Emily Bauer stepped into the Miller's Coffee House as usual. The small cafe was filled with the warm scent of freshly ground coffee. As she stepped behind the counter, she took a deep breath. The smell always relaxed her a little. Although she could feel the lingering exhaustion from the night before on her shoulders, her face bore the usual gentle smile. She had been working there for 2 years. This job was not just a source of income for her, but also the only thing holding her life together. After working at the cafe to cover her mother's hospital bills, she also worked extra hours at a restaurant in the evenings. Sometimes, she felt like everything was closing in on her, but she didn't have the luxury of giving up. Life was tough, but she had never neglected to be kind to people. She had made it a principle, because she believed that no matter who someone was, everyone needed a sincere smile. She turned on the coffee machine and began preparing for the morning. As she organized the cups, her mind briefly emptied, readying herself for the day's fast pace. Everything was going as it usually did. The door opened, a customer placed an order, and she moved quickly to prepare and serve the coffee she had done countless times before. But that day, though it had started like any other, she had no idea that she was heading toward a life-changing encounter. With the opening of the door, the person who walked in would trigger the moment that would forever change Emily's world. When the small bell on the door rang, Emily glanced up from the coffee cup she was holding at the man who had entered. He was tall, and his worn-out coat suggested that he had been wearing the same clothes for a long time. His hair was slightly messy, and the lines on his face carried the marks of someone who had been through years of hardship. But despite all this, there was a different light in his eyes, a strange balance, looking around with both a proud and shy expression. The man quietly moved toward the cafe's display case, which held freshly baked pastries, croissants, and brownies. His eyes lingered particularly on a chocolate tart. Emily recognized that look, the silent echo of a desire that one could barely admit to themselves. For a moment, she saw his fingers almost reaching for the glass of the display, but then they quickly pulled back. It was as if he felt ashamed to even think about such a small luxury. He took a deep breath, turned away, and put his hand in his pocket. As his fingers fumbled through the loose change, his shoulders slumped slightly. At that moment, Emily felt a sharp pain in her heart. She didn't know what he was going through, but the scene felt familiar. Deprivation. A silently accepted lack. And the effort not to burden anyone else. Without thinking, she moved. A sudden decision, an instinctive act of kindness. When her eyes met the man's tired gaze, she called out from behind the counter with a sincere smile. "You're lucky. It's happy hour right now. We're giving a free dessert to the first customer." The man's eyes shifted first to her and then to the pastry in the display case. There was a brief pause. Then, a look of surprise spread across his face. "Really?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily nodded gently, picking up the chocolate tart from the shelf. She carefully wrapped it and gently placed it in front of him. "Yes, really. Enjoy." The man hesitated for a few seconds before touching the package, as if trying to figure out if this was real. Then, he tilted his head slightly, and the gratitude in his eyes transformed into a warmth that was almost tangible. "You didn't have to do this." Emily shrugged lightly and smiled. "Everyone deserves a small gesture sometimes." The man slowly extended his hand and took the tart. He stood silent for a few more seconds, as if still unable to believe it. Then, he took a deep breath, looked up, and met Emily's gaze. In his eyes, something different had replaced the initial shyness, maybe a bit of hope, or perhaps the warm memory of kindness he had long forgotten. "Thank you. Really." In that moment, a quiet stillness filled the cafe. Outside, life continued as usual, people walking, cars passing by, streetlights losing the glow from the night. But inside, in this small moment, something was happening that reminded everyone that kindness still existed in the world. Emily simply smiled. Sometimes, the smallest gestures could make a big difference in someone's life. But the warmth of the moment quickly faded, replaced by a sharp voice from the back of the cafe. "Emily. What do you think you're doing?" Emily's shoulders tensed instinctively. A knot suddenly tightened in her throat. She recognized the voice, Daniel Hartmann, the cafe owner. His voice was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the warm atmosphere of the cafe like a knife. When Emily looked up, she saw Daniel approaching her with firm steps. His face was serious, his brows furrowed, and there was an expression of questioning anger in his eyes. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he stood with his hands on his hips, scanning the room to see how many customers had noticed what was going on. Emily instinctively tried to stand up straighter, but a wave of unease squeezed her from the inside. Her hand still rested on the empty package on the counter, her breath held. Her voice was silent for a moment, but she soon regained her composure. I just gave away a small dessert," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll pay for it." Daniel tilted his head slightly, narrowing his eyes at her. He stayed silent for a few seconds, and that silence made Emily feel even more uncomfortable. Finally, he took a deep breath and crossed his arms over his chest. "This isn't a charity, Emily," he said, his voice cold and clear. "If you want to hand out desserts, do it somewhere else." For a brief moment, Emily's heart raced. Something inside her tightened, not anger, but more like disappointment and helplessness. The dessert wouldn't have cost the cafe much. It was just a small gesture. That was all. But there was no sign of understanding in Daniel's eyes. A strange silence settled over the cafe after his words. A few nearby customers had looked up, but no one said anything. People often preferred to stay quiet in situations like this. Daniel took a step back. Emily noticed that he flinched slightly, his gaze avoiding hers. His face shifted from surprise to discomfort. In just a few seconds, he seemed to act like he hadn't wanted the chocolate tart at all. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his eyes downcast. "I should go." Emily quickly intervened. "No, it's fine." Her voice was soft, but there was a rising sense of helplessness within her. She couldn't just let him leave like this. Doing something kind shouldn't have to come at the cost of someone's dignity. But Daniel's harsh voice had already made up its mind. "If you ever do something like this again, you're done." Emily's heart raced. She felt like she had to make a decision in that moment. Either she would stay silent, keep her job, and let this person be hurt right in front of her. Or she would stand up for herself, but she had no idea what the consequences might be. She swallowed, trying to speak without looking away from Daniel. "What harm does this do?" she said, her voice soft at first, but then gaining strength. "The cafe isn't going to close down over one missing dessert, right?" Daniel's eyebrows furrowed even more. "That's not the point, Emily. Rules apply to everyone. If you give to one, you have to give to all. Then, things get out of hand." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. She had heard this argument before, the idea that kindness could lead to injustice. But sometimes, rules ignored the real needs of people. The man stood still for a few seconds, then lowered his head and left the cafe quickly. The sound of the door closing and the soft chime of the bell left behind a cold silence. Emily's hands trembled slightly. She wasn't sure if what she had done was wrong. But a voice inside her whispered that she had done the right thing. Still, that voice was not as strong as Daniel's anger. She took a deep breath, leaning against the counter, her hands clenched. She knew she was in the middle of an internal struggle. But for now, she wasn't planning on losing. The next morning, when Emily arrived at work, there was an unusual tension in the air. Normally, the only sounds heard in the town square during the early hours were the chirping of birds and the hum of a few car engines. But today, the air felt different. As she was preparing to start the coffee machine, the sound of heavy engines outside filled her ears. For a moment, she looked up and glanced toward the window, her eyes widening. The quiet street of the town was now shaken by the echoes of a military convoy passing through. Black SUVs, followed by armored vehicles and soldiers marching in disciplined formation. Within moments, they came to a halt right in front of Miller's coffee house. Suddenly, everyone in the cafe stopped moving. A spoon fell from a plate, clinking as it hit the table, one customer left their coffee cup half-finished, and a few people pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Conversations turned into hushed whispers of curiosity. Emily felt her heart race. A strange silence had fallen over the cafe, only the heavy footsteps of the soldiers outside could be heard. There was a brief pause in front of the door, and then the small bell above it rang. The man who entered was a colonel, dressed in a dark green uniform adorned with medals. His shoulders were square, his walk sharp and decisive. His perfectly pressed sleeves carried the discipline of years in his posture. His face was stern, but his eyes held a controlled authority. But there was someone else with him. A young man, his hair neatly combed and wearing a perfectly fitted marine uniform, accompanied the colonel. Despite his uniform's flawless appearance, Emily recognized him immediately. The man from yesterday. Her breath caught in her throat. The same man who had been too shy to even show he was hungry, the one who had lowered his shoulders in embarrassment as he counted the change in his pockets. Now, he was standing straight in front of her, wearing a flawless uniform adorned with honor medals. How could this be possible? Emily's fingers gripped the edge of the counter. Inside her, a whirlwind of emotions stirred shock, curiosity, and perhaps even a little fear. The man with the shy eyes from yesterday now stood before her as someone completely different. Everyone in the cafe was watching them. No one dared to speak. A heavy silence hung in the air. And in that moment, the man took a step toward Emily. Daniel Hartmann rubbed his hands together in bewilderment, a strange tension settling over his face. He wasn't used to scenes like this, no matter who they were. Having people arrive at his cafe with a military convoy was not part of any ordinary day. His eyes first landed on the colonel, then shifted to the man standing straight beside him. Emily's words from the day before about the man who had silently waited by the display case and lowered his shoulders in embarrassment while counting his spare change flashed in his mind. But this couldn't be the same person, could it? "How can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice slightly trembling. The colonel fixed his sharp, authoritative gaze on him. Every word he spoke felt like a command. "Is Emily Bauer here?" The moment Emily's name was mentioned, the cafe was plunged into complete silence. A few customers, who had been sitting sipping their coffee, looked up, their phones forgotten as they put their attention on the scene unfolding. One of the waiters dropped the order slip from their hand, but no one had the courage to pick it up. Outside, the hum of the engine still resonated, but inside, time seemed to have stopped. Daniel, stunned, turned his head, his face drained of color. She works here but the colonel cut Daniel off with a sharp shake of his head. "We know." That single word seemed to intensify the tension in the air. Then the man from yesterday took a step forward. He was no longer wearing the worn-out coat or messy hair. Instead, he wore a perfectly fitted military uniform, gleaming medals on his chest, and a carefully embroidered name tag on his left collar. The insignia pinned on his uniform clearly indicated how high his rank was. Emily's breath hitched. This couldn't be possible. The man from yesterday, the one who didn't want to show his hunger, the one who had counted his loose change with embarrassment, the one who had stood before the chocolate tart, then left with his shoulders down in shame. Now, he was here, standing before her as someone completely different. Emily's eyes widened, and the questions in her mind clashed with each other. How could this be? What had happened last night? And why? Why was a colonel asking for her? The man locked eyes with Emily. The shyness from the day before had been replaced by a serious determination. There was no trace of hunger or shame in his eyes anymore, just a gaze so strong, it could silence the entire room. Then, he parted his lips. And with those words, he spoke the ones that would change Emily's life forever. Emily's world seemed to stop in that moment. Everyone in the cafe held their breath. A few customers lowered their phones and fixed their eyes entirely on the scene. Daniel's face had gone pale, the man who had just been rubbing his hands with a stern expression now silent, unable to say anything. The other cafe staff still exchanged confused glances, seemingly unable to comprehend what was happening. Emily's heartbeat echoed in her ears. "We want you to join us in the Veteran Support Program," Michael Krause said, his eyes serious but warm. "We need people who can help war veterans, who can support them in finding their way back to life. And you, Emily, showed us last night with what you did that you're the right person for this." Emily blinked several times in disbelief. She felt as if she were in a strange dream. Last night, she had only acted on what came to her heart, a small act of kindness, a moment of empathy. She had never imagined that it could have such a profound impact on someone's life. "But I just gave a dessert," she whispered. Michael shook his head gently with a smile. "No, you gave a person worth. It's not always about food or money. Sometimes, the smallest thing, a look, a gesture, something that lets someone feel seen, can save a life. You did more than you think, Emily." A lump formed in Emily's throat. Her eyes filled with tears, but she fought them back. She didn't know what to say. The colonel stepped forward and spoke. "We help many people who have served this country but are struggling to deal with life's hardships. Not just veterans, but their families as well. What you did showed us that you are the right person. If you accept, we can train you and make you part of this program. By working with us, you can help those carrying the scars of war." Emily's mind was completely scrambled. Here she was, working at this small cafe, holding down 2 jobs to cover her mother's hospital bills. But deep down, hadn't she always wanted to do more? She had always wanted to help others. But could she really do it? The silence in the cafe was filled only with Emily's thoughts. Daniel Hartmann, still unsure of what to say, perhaps now realizing how insignificant his harsh words and scolding had been the day before. Michael took another step forward, and looking directly at Emily, gently added, "This is a chance, Emily. A chance to truly make a difference. Will you accept?" Emily took a deep breath. Could this new path, one she had never considered before but had secretly longed for in her heart, be the opportunity she had always wanted? Daniel's mocking laughter sliced through the tension in the cafe like a knife. "She's just a waitress. What could she possibly understand about this?" he grumbled, crossing his arms over his chest. The sneer on his face tied a knot in Emily's stomach. But this time, Emily felt different. It wasn't the same feeling of fear that she'd felt on those other days. If it had been yesterday, perhaps she would have stayed silent, lowered her head, and endured the humiliation. But now, there were people in front of her who saw her value. And most importantly, she understood how even the smallest of actions could carry such great meaning. The colonel turned to Daniel with a cold look. The sharpness in his eyes carried the same determination that a soldier showed when targeting their aim in battle. "And yet," he said in a firm but calm voice, "in one night, she made a greater difference than you've ever made in your entire life." The atmosphere in the cafe shifted completely. People turned their eyes toward Daniel. Just hours ago, he had walked around the cafe, thinking of himself as the master of everything, the owner of the place. But now, he stood there, silently. His authority had been shattered, and he couldn't find a word to say. Emily swallowed hard, clearing the lump in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Last night, she had gone to bed afraid of losing her job as a simple waitress. But now, in front of her, was a chance that could completely change her life. She took a deep breath, pushing the fear in her chest aside, and tried to believe in herself. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her. "If I can really help," she began, her voice trembling at first, but gaining strength as she continued. "I accept." A warm smile spread across Michael Krause's face. In his eyes, there was a mix of pride and satisfaction. "Then welcome, Emily." He extended his hand. Emily hesitated for a moment, then smiled and shook his hand. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, she truly felt like she belonged. Months later, Emily Bauer found herself in a completely different world. The young woman who had once felt trapped in that small coffee shop, believing life was nothing more than a daily struggle to make ends meet, was now walking a different path. After joining the Veteran Support Program, the training she received taught her to understand the challenges faced by war veterans and how she could truly help them. Working alongside Michael Krause and his team, she provided support to veterans going through tough times, helping them rebuild their lives. Emily was no longer just handing over a coffee cup, she was giving people hope. In the process, she realized that she wasn't just helping others, she was helping herself too. She had discovered her own strength. She knew now that she was no ordinary person, she was someone who could change lives. A year later, she received support to open her own rehabilitation center. Named the Bauer Support Center, it provided shelter, education, and psychological support to homeless veterans. This initiative, which she had started, created a massive ripple on social media and inspired thousands of people. And one day, one morning, someone appeared at the door of her new center. Michael Krause stepped inside with his familiar smile. For the first time in years, he looked entirely at peace. "I knew you could do it," he said, his eyes filled with genuine pride. Emily took a deep breath and looked around her. What had once been just a dream was now a reality. That small act of kindness, that simple gesture of offering a chocolate tart, had created a massive change in her life and in the lives of others. With shining eyes, she responded, "And I learned that from you, Michael. How the smallest things can make the biggest difference." That day, Emily Bauer experienced one of the happiest moments of her life. She was no longer just a waitress. She was someone who changed the world with a simple touch of a life. And most importantly, she had finally found the place where she truly belonged. If this story has inspired you and you believe that small acts of kindness can make a big difference, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more stories and inspiring moments. If you'd like to support us further, you can become a part of our community by clicking the join button.